During today's conversation, you may notice some choppiness in the sound quality, especially on Eryn's end of the conversation. Please listen and bear with us through these technical difficulties. We still feel the content is worth listening to, and we hope you have a good experience listening to what we have to say about the growth zone. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. This is Coaching as Benevolence, a podcast for people who are curious about using coaching for self-development. I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings Grief and Loss Coaching.
And I'm LaShawn with Michelle Sage Place Positive Intelligence Coaching. Today we are going to look at the growth zone. And last time we did talk about the growth zone, and we looked at the different zones in this model. We looked at the comfort zone, the fear zone, which is that place where you feel maybe you're comparing yourself to others or you're afraid to take risks. And it's scary because you're not familiar with what's expected of you or what to do in a changing situation. And from the fear zone, we go into the learning zone. And if you can get past the fear zone, then you get into that learning zone where you're taking in new skills and you are feeling more comfortable. So you're expanding your comfort zone in the learning zone. And Eryn and I, in that episode that we talked about the growth zone, decided that the learning zone is our comfort zone. And then we talked about growth zone, which is that zone where you have bigger goals. From the Maslow's hierarchy of need, you're in those higher levels where you're looking at self-actualization, reaching your fullest potential. And today, Eryn and I are going to look at the growth zone. We're going to spend some time talking about that. And we will also, of course, be talking about the other zones. But in the last episode, we did spend quite a bit of time in the learning zone and the fear zone. And now we want to just kind of spend some time looking at the growth zone. So Eryn, when you hear the term growth zone and when you think about growth zone, what are some characteristics of that for you?
So something I've been thinking about since our last recording of the growth zone or the comfort zone model, and then how it's kind of showing up a little bit more today in relationship to the growth zone is shame and how we face our own shame. Really stemming out of this idea that we are all broken, we all make mistakes, we've all done things that we probably regret in some way or another. And when we don't interrogate those or don't face that shame, it kind of leaves us wavering kind of in these zones. I think in the fear zone, right? But when we can own our shame and use that as a catalyst for self-development and growth, I think that's really where we start to root into that growth zone. So the word shame really comes up when I think about how do we get to the growth zone. And for me, it is about facing shame. And that's really hard to do, especially in a kind of public sense. But I think it's worth doing in a private sense too, right? Whether that is, facing that shame through talking or having dialogue with someone, through restorative justice, like we've talked about, or through even, more journaling or just conversations with friends and family. I think when we can see the brokenness in ourselves, we can be more gentle with ourselves as we continue to grow, and we can be more gentle with others and helping them find their growth in the growth zone too. So shame has come up quite a bit in how I think about this model and how it can be used as actually a tool to navigate with our brokenness through to new understanding, to living out our dreams, to finding our purpose, and to being okay with wherever we're at. LaShawn, what else do you want to add here about the growth zone?
I like that you brought up shame. It's really interesting to me because I think that shame is such a heavy term for me when I think of shame. When I think of shame, I think of shadows, our shadow selves, those parts of ourselves that we deny and those parts of ourselves that we suppress. And I do believe that that is a huge part of growth. Because unless we bring those things to light, we take those shadow selves and bring them into the light, we accept where we are, we accept their purpose or their role or their place in our lives, in whatever part of our lives they arose. I think it's really important to face that. And as you mentioned, the importance of facing that shame and admitting to the brokenness of our natures. And the other thing that came up for me is we discussed this earlier in probably one of our first episodes where we were talking about ourselves and what we do. And one thing that did come up is the idea of being broken open. And when you mentioned that about we're all broken and we need to accept that brokenness of ourselves, the one thing that came to mind is the idea of broken open. And I think that's where growth happens as well, when you're open to your vulnerabilities, to your weaknesses as well as your strengths, and you're willing to accept where you are. And the other thing that comes to mind when you say the word shame is judgment. In the positive intelligence space, we often have that judge, and the judge is present. And when we know the judge is present is when we are looking at things in a heavy and very critical way. And shame to me is a judgment. It's something that needs to be hidden, something that needs to be kept under wraps, something that should not be discussed in polite company, as one would say, but needs to be addressed in order to grow, because that shame can immobilize you. It can make it difficult for you to move into the growth zone. So I'm glad you brought that up. I do think that that is part of, perhaps it's the in-between of the comfort zone, fear zone, learning zone. And maybe that shame is the kind of in-between or characteristic of moving from the learning zone into the growth zone. Something that hasn't come up in the literature that I've seen regarding this model, and I think is, to me, it resonates because it's something that I'm faced with in my own journey, and I'm sure others can relate to that as well. Another thing that comes up for me is with shame is community, because I think shame, I've heard it said, and I cannot attribute it to any person, and I'm sure it could be attributed to a person, but that shame has to do with societal norms or some judgment on a community level, something that you can be shamed. There are shame-based societies. And embarrassment, which is similar, it's like a cousin of shame, is an internal thing, like something that you might feel embarrassed about, something about yourself. But that shame is kind of something that's brought upon you. It's something that's kind of imposed by going against norms or not following the status quo. And so people can be shamed into following the status quo. They can be shamed into correcting their behavior. Eryn, do you have anything to say about that?
I like that you bring the societal aspect up because, yes, there is this external force that creates shame at the individual and at the kind of societal level as well, that is not typically healthy or not helpful. I think that internal shame, and you reframing it as embarrassment, I like that kind of play on the language, and I can see how both of them could be felt maybe similarly and differently internally. But I think when we can own our own embarrassment or shame that maybe isn't due to societal factors. I mean, there will always be societal factors there, but is more of what our soul or more of who we are, our true person, our true self is telling us, hey, that's not us. And here's how you can stand in your light. And I think that's the other thing when it comes to the growth zone is like, how do people become comfortable standing in their light, in their truth? And to be brave, I do think we do need to face kind of some of those internal places within ourselves that causes conflict. Of course, there's also the societal structures that have masked important voices and harmed many people. So that gets really complex. when we think of that piece, and I guess for today, I'm focusing a little bit more on the internal, but would also maybe like to explore that external piece with you too. I like that you have brought that into here because that cannot be separated. That really is part of a person's ability to move into the growth zone, especially when there is a mismatch between how that individual feels about themselves as their true self and what society is saying and where is the dissonance. And so, you know, this isn't just about somebody owning their own shame. I think culturally, we need to revisit shame on so many levels. And I think that is what will also help people move into that growth zone, be grounded in their purpose, and live in a way that supports well being and good health and those sorts of things. Shame comes from so many different contexts. So you mentioned the societal, and then we've talked about the internal, and then we see it show up in different, possibly religions, and then we see it show up in popular culture. We see it show up in the way the media addresses people, and the way that what is shown to us in our own circles of influence. And then the other thing that kind of is really timely is that, a lot of people are only seeing news that shames the people that are not like them. There are logarithms, or I'm not sure if I said that correctly, that place news articles in front of individuals that really just kind of show what they think they want to see versus showing the holistic picture. So I guess that's a little bit of a tangent, but I guess I wanted to add that in just to say there's a lot as people kind of navigate these zones, a lot of external forces at play too. LaShawn, what else can you help me kind of add here with the external forces or help kind of wrap that part of the conversation up a little bit more?
One thing that came to mind as you were talking is the idea of society's role in this model. We value progress. We value growth. There's a tendency for people to feel like if they're not making progress in a certain way, if they're not making big moves, or if they are comfortable where they're at, that somehow is an indication of stagnancy, and it's an indication of, I don't know, not failure, but it's an indication that one is not really living their life. There's language around growth that excludes someone who's maybe they've reached their full potential. And to one person looking at them, like let's say they're really, really good at making cabinets. And that is something that they find joy in and they're fulfilled in. And then someone might look at them and say, oh, that person's not living their life. They're not living to their fullest potential. They could be, something else, and so that there's this kind of imposed idea that one is living their fullest potential if they're living that high life, if they've got lots of money, or if they have a lot of material wealth, or where a successful human being might be. Whereas someone who's, a farmer and they have a small plot of land and they're, really good at what they do in that arena, then that could be also seen as in your growth zone. I think that it would be a good idea to really look at the definition of growth and a growth zone when we're looking at it like a societal level. And for me, I think a characteristic of the growth zone is where you are fulfilled and you are making your contribution, whatever that contribution is to life, to society, and you're satisfied. I think that to me is the growth zone. It doesn't have to be, the CEO of a company or, you're making big, big moves in your life, but that you are fulfilled and you are satisfied and you feel energized and you feel like you're in a place that works for you, that is life affirming. And it does not have to necessarily be that you're constantly growing and expanding. It's more of a kind of maybe a deepening of your skills, or a honing of your skills rather than breadth, it's depth. But it could be both. I mean, it really just depends on the person. I prefer to use characteristics of the different zones based on how you feel. What are your feelings? Like, what does it feel like to be in the learning zone? There's curiosity, there's nervousness that goes with learning new things and trying new things. But then when you're in the growth zone, you're in the space where you are satisfied with what you're doing and you're fulfilled. Those are the two things that come to mind when I think of your growth zone. How about you, Eryn? Anything coming to mind?
I love how you moved into the feelings aspect of how do each of these zones feel, because as I was sitting here thinking about this model as you were talking, I was thinking about that embodiment piece. What like with you have to see the growth zone model with the four circles and then the arrow going horizontally through. And I think that arrow is that individual, and the arrow should be more fluid and back and forth. I don't like how all
Mm-hmm.
these models tend to be. But anyway, you
Linear.
are on
Yep.
that line in the model, and you are embodied. And so what does that feel like to be in your shoes in the comfort zone? And you already started going there. It's like, oh yes, that's exactly, we were kind of like on the same wavelength with that type of thinking, because that is one of the probably only ways one can find their compass through this, going back into their bodies, feeling what each of these feel like, and really listening to kind of that inner voice. So I think while this is kind of a compass model in itself, so here's how you go from the comfort zone to the fear zone, from the fear to the learning to growth. Um, it's more about the individual being their true compass and really rooting into what that feels like within each of these, and going in between them in a non-linear way. And then as we're in that growth zone, because we're focused a little bit on that piece today, and it's, I love how you talked about it's a deepening of skills. Sometimes it's not necessarily a movement up the corporate ladder or a movement across the country, right? Like it can be something really small that impacts your daily life, that helps your well-being and helps others' well-being as well. So I like this idea of our growth zone. When we think of like growth moments, we tend to think of them as big. When kids grow up, it's like, oh, you just had a growth spurt. And we think they grew like many, many inches. Well, in fact, they probably just grew a little bit. And that's what this is all about, are those spurts of growth that are not necessarily meant to be these big steps. On the other hand, they can be, right? Like that can be something that comes up that can be really helpful. I've met with people, and I myself have had those experiences where I just have known I'm on the wrong path. And I knew I needed to set a new goal and pivot, and I didn't know what that looked like, but it had to happen like fast, right? Like I had to make a shift, or these other people that I've met with have had to make these shifts rather quickly, so oftentimes due to external circumstances, but oftentimes also to that inner voice, that inner compass that's part of this model. So growth can also be this one thing that is quite dramatic and does make quite a shift in somebody's life. And then thinking about just how we talked about going back to that comfort zone, and in our episode where we introduced the comfort zone model, and thinking about how that is like a landing pad, a safety net for us in some ways. I just keep thinking about how can we encourage ourselves and other people to make that comfort zone theirs, like really own that. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Who's in that comfort zone, and really trying to make that theirs, whether they're very focused on a goal, they're, engaged in goal directed behavior, or if they're content with where they're at and sometimes still need to find that retreat in the comfort zone. That also kind of came up for me too. LaShawn, what about the growth zone really kind of makes you feel energized?
When I am in the growth zone, the thing that energizes me or makes me feel energized about the growth zone is this feeling of fulfillment that comes when you're doing something that just really is aligned with who you really are, and you can shine in all of the areas that you're really good at. So for example, I feel like I'm in the growth zone when I am interacting with others and I am making connections. So in the Strengths Finder, one of my top strengths is connector. And when somebody comes to me and says, I'm thinking about doing XYZ, and I'm able to go through my mental Rolodex and go through all the people that I know who can help that person, and I, make introductions, and I'm able to connect people. And that to me is me in my growth zone. It's a fulfilling experience. And I feel comfortable in that because that comes naturally to me. However, it is in my growth zone because it's allowing me to connect others and then to see, what works and what doesn't work, because sometimes I connect people and it doesn't work, but it allows me to exercise that talent that I have. To me, the growth zone, the most energizing part of the growth zone is living your potential. So in the learning zone, you are gathering skills and knowledge, and you're navigating new territory and you're learning as you go. The growth zone is when you are applying that knowledge, you're applying those skills, and you're living and experiencing on a practical level those things that have been in the learning zones, just thoughts or theories, for example. How about you, Eryn? What's energizing to you in the growth zone?
I like how you have framed this here with kind of, I guess, let me take a step back here. So you brought up strengths in Strengths Finder, and Achiever is in my top 5. And so I have a natural aptitude to kind of push ahead to what's next. I will say, since making significant life shifts over the past 4 to 5 years, that achiever mindset has been very much dampened. And if I took the assessment again, it might still be in there, but it wouldn't be at the level that it was. So the old me, to answer your question, would have said, being in the growth and what energizes me is all the newness and, pushing forward and, kind of learning new things, but also applying them and finding creative ways to approach problems. And yes, to all of those things with the current me, but it's a little bit more tempered. The growth zone doesn't have to be for me this space of achievement oriented thinking. And it's more about knowing who I am. It's more about rooting into where I'm at in my life's journey. What do I want and need to keep living a good life, or to live a good life? And what does that look like at a more deeply personal level? That to me is a lot different than how I used to view the growth zone. So I think being on my, owning my own business and being outside of a very large system, naturally I've been able to root into some of those kind of more goodness factors within myself, and really kind of show up how I want and need to show up. So again, going back to what we brought up, or LaShawn first introduced in the beginning of the episode about like systems and societal expectations, sometimes we are in systems or work within systems or within teams that don't really help us actualize our potential in the growth zone. So what then? You have options, right? You can leave your job, find something different. Sounds so much more simpler than it is, because that's very complex and it's not that simple. But what else can you do? What else do you have available within you? What internal tools do you have? And what resources that are external to you do you have to ground and root into yourself a little bit more effectively? So those tools, are often brought out from a coach or a therapist, and it often takes that therapy and or coach work time over time until something starts to shift. So it's more of a process. And so it's more of a longer term goal, or a longer term shift in the way of being, or in the skills that one's gaining or using in that growth zone. Yeah, I guess to summarize, I've changed, and then also I've been able to change because of the circumstances that surround me now. And so what are the resources and tools that listeners have at their disposal to live in the growth zone in a way that is life-giving and supportive to their own growth.
Those are all really great points. One thing that really came up for me when you were talking about your shift from, the external, I would say, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but how I would see that is like more achievements, more focused on the product rather than the progress, the process. The thing that you said about knowing yourself and really that goes back to that depth that can be characteristic of the growth zone for some. It is for me. It's that depth. And I even would say that the growth zone is comfort with change. When you reach that point in your life where you can pivot easily, where you can know yourself so well to know that I've got this, I can shift with the times, I can adapt, I'm resilient. I think those are characteristic of the growth zone as well. I think it's when you can be okay with uncertainty and you're not going to slip into the fear zone so quickly when you're in the growth zone and when things happen, external factors in the case of your story that you were talking about with going from the old you of being an achiever, that being very strong in your strengths. And now it's a more introspective look and it's knowing yourself. And I think that's characteristic of the growth zone too. I think people who are comfortable in the growth zone, who are living in the growth zone most of the time, are people who know themselves really well. It goes also back to what you said about shame and shadow. And that is also part of self-awareness and self-knowledge. Knowing those parts of yourself that you're not so happy about or that you're not willing to bring to the light. When you're in the growth zone, you're in a space where you recognize the value of those shadow aspects and you recognize the value of exploring those parts of yourself that you might not deem as acceptable or strong or whatever positive light you might put on aspects of yourself. But then you're able to integrate that into your awareness, into your being. And I think that's another aspect of being and living in the growth zone. Another thing that you brought up that made me think about another aspect, you mentioned coaches and therapists and people who can help you out. And one thing that I would encourage people who are exploring and wanting to live more in the growth zone is finding that network, find other people who are living in the growth zone who can encourage and inspire you to continue to find your way in the growth zone, to find comfort in being in the growth zone. So when you are dealing with challenges and you're dealing with expansion, then you would have other people who are doing the same thing and can check in with you. So you can like join a mastermind, or you could just have a group of friends that you check in with on a regular basis where you're discussing things like your shadow aspects, shame, and you're able to be vulnerable with this group of people. And then again, I want to bring back the importance of having a thought partner and having someone who can help you navigate these zones and recognize when you're in these zones, when you're in the growth zone, when you're in the comfort zone, when you're in the fear zone, et cetera, et cetera. And even find value in these different zones, that they're not necessarily good or bad. They are indicative of where you are in your growth. And I would say that all of these zones are a part of the process of learning and of changing and of growing, because that's, as human beings, that's what we do. We grow. We're never the same person a year ago, or we know this because our body changes. We don't have the same body that we had when we were infants. Right? So growth is just part of our experience. And a thought partner like a coach or a therapist or someone who could help you navigate these zones and find your strengths and weaknesses and what works for you and what does it mean for you to be in your growth zone? What does it mean to be in a fear zone? What does it mean for you? What are the characteristics? How are you embodying this? And what are some strategies for getting from one place to another and navigating those zones? Any thoughts, Eryn?
Yeah. Yeah. So at the beginning of where you were talking about resiliency, adaptability, not sitting in fear, I just was thinking, yes, yes, yeah, thinking and feeling, yes. Um, and that sitting in fear can just sometimes be so hard when we're in that growth zone because it is scary sometimes. And so recognizing how then you shifted and talked about how it's not good or bad, it's part of the process, and just recognizing that it is part of the process. And the more practiced you get at pivoting from fear to curiosity or fear to love or fear to embodiment, certain things, the easier that gets. So there are tangible strategies, right? There are tools that help when you are in the growth zone. And then the other thing I was thinking of, you mentioned like our bodies change, and they do. And this came up the other day for me, and I can't remember what prompted it, but it was just about like, we know in a lot of the literature that we have a lot of information, it seems like, on childhood development, early adult development, adolescent development, and then you have this like long, 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 long phase of adulthood, right? And people just think, oh, we get to adulthood and then that's it. And I think it just partially because it feels so nebulous or so big, right? Like if we're in adulthood, that means we're here in adulthood all the way until if we live to 100 or whatever it may be. I think that causes a lot of problems in a lot of ways because it does kind of bring into the forefront quotes such as "you can't teach an old dog new tricks," right? Like things like that. Um, Ideas that we have stopped learning, we have stopped growing, and and that's not true, right? And we're growing probably more because of all the wisdom we're amassing in adulthood. So it's like, how do we tap into that and use that in a way that helps us in the growth zone, helps us to maybe root deeper, like you've talked about, into our specific growth areas or what we currently have contentment with? Or how do we use that as a way to create things that are a little bit different, right? Or be okay with pivoting and shifting and not always being the same. And so I think just for people who are like 30 through 100 thinking about growth zone and what that specifically means, for them. And I know there are a lot of life changes during this time, of course, with grief and loss. There's a lot of loss often during this time. And there's a lot of identity shifts from being partnered to unpartnered, or from being in school to not in school, to being in your career to retired. Like there's so many different transitional shifts. So there's automatically growth that's having to kind of happen within those. But what would make that growth more effective? What would make that growth more sustainable for the individuals as well as for the greater whole? So I guess that was the other thing that really came up, is this idea that growth doesn't stop in adulthood. It's like it actually magnifies. We have so much to learn and take responsibility for that. And I know we've talked in the past, how we have a childlike joy towards learning or childlike characteristics. We can go back and embody that to make that growth zone more effective for ourselves. But we also have to be able to stand in all of the lessons we've learned up into this point, wherever we're at, to embrace those, going back again to that shame and shadow work, and make shifts out of love and not out of fear. And I think that's really what it always comes down to for me, is like, are you leaning more towards a love-based decision or a fear-based decision? And thinking about how that plays out in the growth zone too.
Those are all great points. And I think that really brings us to our coaching nugget of wisdom. And do you have one that you would like to share? And there's so much wisdom that you dropped there, but like if you were to like make that into a nugget, what would it be? Or if you would like more time to think, I can share mine.
I don't know. I think it's like being able to hold the paradox of being comfortable and uncomfortable and knowing when those need to show up in your life and when you need to lean into the different areas of comfort and discomfort. So that would be my coaching nugget of wisdom. What's discomfort for you? What's comfortable for you? And then what are the strategies you root into um, to engage that discomfort in the growth zone?
So my coaching nugget of wisdom would be that very similar to yours, Erin, and that is again that adage, know thyself. And my question would be, what do these zones feel like for you? So when you are in a state of learning, what does that feel like? What are some of the emotions that you feel? When you're in your comfort zone, what does that feel like? What are some emotions that you feel? The edge of the comfort zone and the fear zone, what does that feel like? So you're going, usually for me, it's a discomfort with the comfort. It's this feeling like I should be doing more or I can do more. It's kind of, I don't know, kind of itchy feeling. Um, and what is the feeling of the learning zone to the growth zone? What does that feel like? So I really want to encourage you, coaching negative wisdom, and to use one of Erin's beautiful phrases, root into the feelings that you feel when you're in these different zones. Thanks for joining us for Coaching as Benevolence. I'm LaShawn with Mayshell's Sage Place, Positive Intelligence Coaching.
And I'm Eryn with Roots and Wings, Grief and Loss Coaching.
Have a benevolent day.